Welcome along to the final episode in this travel series. After almost 4 weeks at sea, we've crossed the Pacific Ocean from Vancouver, Canada, and in a few short days we'll be reaching Sydney, Australia. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, here's what's been happening so far. I'm on board Royal Caribbean's Ovation of the Seas, and after we left Vancouver, we headed to Seattle for our first port of call. From there, we sailed 2,645 miles to Maui and the beautiful Hawaiian Islands. We spent 2 days there getting to experience all of life has to offer on Maui, and then we moved on to Oahu for a day in Honolulu. Weather was beautiful along the way. We got to experience all of the wonderful landscapes of the Hawaiian Islands, and then we set sail at a beautiful sunset. From there, it was another 5 days heading south to the wonderful French Polynesia. En route, we crossed the equator. We met King Neptune. We transformed from, let me get this right, polywogs to saddlebacks. You'll have to watch the previous episodes to find out what that's about. And then we arrived in beautiful, beautiful French Polynesia. The first 2 days were spent in Moorea, which is just the most amazing, magical paradise island I have ever experienced. And after that, we moved on to Tahiti for our third day. That had mixed reviews on my part, but again, you can catch up with that on the previous episodes. After that, it was back to sea again for another 5 days as we continued the crossing across the Pacific Ocean. We crossed the international date line and ended up in New Zealand. Firstly, we went to the North Island and we went to the 1920s themed town of Napier. From there, we went to Wellington. Unfortunately, the weather was a bit dodgy on that particular day, and it kind of shattered the myth of the whole journey being a beautiful tropical climate, but nonetheless it was enjoyable. And finally, for our third day, we journeyed to the South Island, to the Marlborough region. There we experienced the varied landscapes, the forested landscapes, beautiful gardens, seascapes and vineyards. And after that we sailed out of Queen Charlotte Sound. We're now on the final leg of the crossing, with just 3 days left to go until we reach Sydney. Waking up this morning for our second last day at sea, the captain's forecast from yesterday evening proved to be correct. As we continue across the Tasman Sea, the sea swells have certainly whipped up. Today we've been told that it's about gusty winds of 74 miles an hour and significant sea swells, so we're in for a bumpy time. For only the second time in the whole 4 weeks, we've been told that the stabilisers have been deployed, and it's the first time that the doors to the outer decks have actually been locked. Needless to say, the sick bags are out in good quantity at the stairwells. But all's going well so far. There's plenty of activities going on board. This morning there was quite an interesting talk from the cruise director, who in a former life was actually a Hollywood stuntman and stunt coordinator. So that was something interesting. Other activities included learning how to make those wonderful towel animals.
Morning. It's a flower. No. A monkey. It is another roast chicken, everybody.
No, even after all that tuition, I still can't produce a towel animal. Now, for the rest of the day, there were lots of activities on board. In the afternoon, the Royal Theatre was used as a cinema instead of film being shown on the outer decks. So it was nice to just veg out there and watch the latest Downton Abbey movie. And in the evening, it was a case of back again to the theatre to watch one of the production shows. This was A Beautiful Dream, which I had seen before, but nonetheless, it was pleasant to watch again. And inevitably with Royal Caribbean, it's always a good performance. Now, it was also formal night, but the dining rooms were pretty quiet. Due to the sea conditions, I think a lot of people had chosen to lay low for the day. Waking up this morning for our last day at sea, I was really pleased to find that the blue skies and sunshine had returned. So hopefully we've seen the last of the grey skies, the rain, the wind of yesterday. The sea swells aren't anything like they were. It's much calmer, but still a little bit choppy. Nonetheless, the pool deck is all open again. People are out enjoying the sunshine, so all is good. Now, in terms of my activities for the day, I had an appointment at the hairdressers in the spa this morning. Now, I had booked this quite a while ago before I knew what the sea conditions might be like. So it was certainly an interesting experience being in a salon chair on a high deck at the front of the ship in slightly rocky conditions. But nonetheless, the hairdresser did a good job and I was quite happy with it. In terms of lunch, I decided to treat myself to another speciality lunch in Jamie's Italian. Now, obviously, quite a lot of people had the same idea and it was quite busy and much different to the last time I went there, where there was literally no problem in getting a table. This time there was a little bit of a queue. Nonetheless, the food and the service was still excellent. And finally, I rounded off the day pushing the idea of having to pack my bags as far away as possible. I rounded off the day by going to the Royal Theatre, where there was a farewell variety show. Now, the interesting, slightly amusing thing about this is that one of the guest artists was meant to be a ventriloquist who had performed earlier on this sailing. Unfortunately, he couldn't actually make it because, according to the cruise director, he was still feeling the ill effects of the sea conditions. Doesn't really bode well for a career on a cruise ship if you're prone to seasickness. And now, as we're about to approach Sydney, just to look at some practical information. If you are visiting Australia, inevitably you will obviously need a valid passport, but in addition to that, unless you're an Australian citizen, you will need a visa. This can be got in a number of ways, and generally tourist visas are available for citizens of most countries, I believe, using the electronic travel authorization system. That's the process I went through. It's very straightforward online and you have the outcome very, very quickly. It's good for 12 months and that allows a stay of up to 90 days. So just make sure to get that all sorted in advance. Now, also other practical things to consider if you are cruising into Sydney. And there are two cruise terminals. So one is the White Bay Cruise Terminal and the other is the Overseas Terminal at Circular Quay. Now, the White Bay Terminal is actually only available to smaller ships because basically they have to go in under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The Overseas Passenger Terminal is located in Circular Quay, which is essentially just opposite the Sydney Opera House. So it's a really fantastic location to arrive into. And that's exactly where we were heading on our final morning. After 4 weeks at sea and covering a distance of almost 10,000 miles between all those wonderful destinations that we visited while crossing the Pacific, we're now on the final approach and Sydney is coming into view. This footage was taken at about 5:30 in the morning, just after sunrise, and what I would say is if you're sailing into Sydney Harbour, it would probably be worth getting up even earlier to watch the sail-in from a further distance out. Before embarking on this trip, I had identified that there were likely to be two very memorable locations, one being French Polynesia and the other being the sail into Sydney Harbour. And what I can say now that the voyage has been completed is that both absolutely delivered and lived up to my expectations. I think arriving into Sydney and visiting Australia for the first time, it is really, really spectacular to do so on a cruise ship. Now, as I'm putting this vlog together a little bit after I've disembarked, even at the sight of this footage, it's making me emotional and giving me goosebumps all over again. We were welcomed in by tugboats setting off water cannons. I don't think that's necessarily a regular thing. I think it is due to the fact that the Ovation of the Seas was one of the first, if not the first, cruise ship to have crossed the Pacific since Australia had opened up to cruising again after the COVID shutdown. So it was a pretty special occasion and a big welcome. When I booked, I made sure to pick a cabin on the port side of the ship. I had done my research and I knew that that was going to give me absolutely fantastic views of the Sydney Opera House. It was just incredibly special to watch that before I disembarked the ship. 7:15 Saturday morning, pretty much packed up at this stage, so soon time to get off the ship. After one last lingering look at the Sydney Opera House as viewed from my balcony, it was time to gather my luggage and say goodbye to the balcony cabin that has been my home for the last 4 weeks. Now, in terms of disembarkation, I always personally choose to opt for self-disembarkation, so effectively that means that I'm taking my own luggage with me. It was quite easy because from the ship to the terminal building there was ramped access all the way. Now, there seemed to be quite a lot of people who had opted for this, so the queue was quite long. Self-disembarkation people tend to have the opportunity to go off the ship first before the groups who are doing assisted luggage are actually called. So the queue was on deck 5. It started around Jamie's Italian at the time that I joined it, and from there it snaked all the way down towards 270 at the back of the ship, went to an outer door and then along on the promenade deck until going down the ramp to the terminal building. Going through customs and border security was quite quick. It moved much more smoothly than I anticipated. I did see a few people having luggage searches and a few people having more detailed questioning. I'm not sure what was going on with them, but in general, I think most passengers had a pretty easy time getting off. Once out of the terminal building, I think I would have to describe the situation as one of life's pinch me moments. It was one of those things of standing looking at the enormity of the ship that I've spent the last 4 weeks on, but set against that stunning scenery of the Sydney Harbour Bridge on one side and the Opera House on the other. Just such world-renowned landmarks. It was just really special to be standing there on a sunny Saturday morning. Now, while I have no experience of what it would be like to disembark at the White Bay Cruise Terminal that I mentioned earlier, all I can say is that disembarking at the Overseas Passenger Terminal in Circular Quay was just so convenient if you're staying in the city centre or any place in the vicinity. Basically, Circular Quay is the location at which the public transport system is very well integrated. So it's the public ferries, it is the light rail system, and there's also a mainline rail, I believe. So really from the terminal building to the hub of that transport network is just a simple 4 or 5 minute walk just along there, as you can see. Now, I chose to actually make my way to my hotel. I knew that it was highly unlikely that at 9 o'clock in the morning that my room would be available, but nonetheless I was able to go and drop off my luggage. It was actually just a few stops along on the light rail line, so very convenient, and it left me free to go about exploring Sydney for the rest of the day. One of my favourite ways to get to know a new city is to make use of hop on hop off buses. So that's exactly what I did for my first day in Sydney. Now, in order to start it at the terminus of the bus route, I went back again to Circular Quay, and that's where it departs from. Now, interestingly, at that stage it was probably heading towards 10 o'clock, and I noticed that there were actually still quite a lot of people still coming off the ship. I think they were probably the passengers who had chosen not to do self-disembarkation, so they were the ones who had to wait until their groups were called, where they could then go to the terminal building to pick up their luggage. So it is worth bearing in mind if you want to get off quickly. Now, in terms of the hop on hop off bus tour, I opted for a combination ticket, which was, I believe, 130 Australian dollars. And for that I got 48 hours access onto the hop on hop off bus. I also got the ferry ride, a hop on hop off ferry ride through the harbour, and it also included access to the Sydney Tower. So all quite good value. Now, as if I hadn't enough of being on the ship for 4 weeks, one of the best features of the day was actually doing the ferry ride and getting to go alongside the ship, and again just getting to look at that magnificent building that is the Sydney Opera House, and then heading on after that under the Harbour Bridge. Just truly spectacular. To make the day even more enjoyable, I seem to have been so fortunate in the weather that I experienced. Basically, from speaking to people at the hotel, it appears that the spring to date in Sydney had offered up pretty poor weather, and in actual fact for the past 4 or 5 weekends I was told that it had been pretty wet and miserable, so this was a complete contrast. I have to say, this is the kind of weather that I expected to find in Sydney, so I'd have been incredibly disappointed if I got off that ship this morning and found that it was wet and windy. The hop-on hop-off ferry ride firstly headed towards the Tauranga Zoo area, and after that it went under the harbour bridge and then headed on to Darling Harbour, which is what you're seeing here on screen. Now, there were a number of locations at which I could have disembarked, but I actually chose to stay on board to get the full overall view of what the overall route was like and get a good sense of the city. After a busy day of exploring, I headed back to my accommodation late in the afternoon to get settled in. Now, for my 6-night stay in Sydney, I had actually chosen a serviced apartment concept as opposed to just a standard hotel room. I used a group called the Meriton Suites, and they appear to be an Australian-based company that has this all-suite tourist accommodation concept at many locations all around Sydney and indeed at other locations around Australia. So after spending 4 weeks on a cruise ship in a standard size balcony cabin, it certainly felt surprisingly spacious to have a 1-bedroom apartment to spread out in. It obviously offered all the home comforts, a fully functional kitchen. It had a washer dryer, which is quite essential when you've just come off a cruise ship where you've been reliant on the laundry service prior to that. And it also had a balcony. Now, it was on the 30th floor, so for somebody that doesn't really like heights, the balcony didn't get much use from my perspective, but still nice to have that. The accommodation came in at a cost of just over 210 Australian dollars per night. Now, that also included the government sales tax. So all in all, I felt it was very good value. As I say, mine was a 1-bedroom apartment. There were also other options, including studio units and units without a balcony. And I believe there was also 2-bedroom options. Now, in terms of the actual communal areas of the building, the lift, the hallways and so on, I definitely wouldn't describe them as being luxury. They were just very functional. But the accommodation itself was very comfortable, very clean, very well provided. So no complaints on my part. And it was all very centrally located. It was literally 2 minutes walk from the light rail stop, which was close by. It was close to a supermarket and plenty of eating and dining opportunities in the general area. So very good for exploring. So in terms of exploring, for the remainder of this episode, what I'm going to do is just to run through the various different activities and places that I visited, just to give you an idea of what perhaps you might like to get up to if you happen to visit Sydney at some point, whether on a cruise ship or otherwise. Now, in terms of the second day of the 48-hour pass that I had on the hop-on, hop-off bus tour, that actually provided me with the opportunity to not only experience more of the city, but also to take that same bus out to Bondi Beach, which is what you're seeing here. Now, my visit to Bondi happened to occur on a Sunday, and I think it's probably the prime day for beach-going population of Sydney. So it was a very busy place, and while the beach was busy, it was nothing compared to the traffic that was in the area. It was certainly incredibly congested. Now, also, just one thing to point out, and it's of particular relevance to solo travellers. Many casual dining places seem to operate a situation where the customer is first of all required to select a table. Usually the tables are numbered, and after that they then need to actually go to a counter, or if it's an outdoor dining area, to actually go inside to place their order. The food in most cases will generally be delivered to the table after that. Now, this presents the practical problem for a solo traveller of the table potentially not being available when you come back out after placing your order. Or also, are you going to risk actually leaving your bag or something there to identify that it's occupied? It did get a little bit frustrating because so many places that I would have liked to dine at operated on this basis. So eventually, really, it just became a case of needing to find full service restaurants when I wanted to eat out. Now, other activities around Sydney that you could engage in, as you're seeing here, there's the Sydney Harbour Bridge climb. Now, personally, I would not in a million years put myself through that, and I applaud people who are courageous enough to do it. but certainly I was perfectly happy to watch it from ground level. I did venture up into the Sydney Sky Tower, I think that's the name of it. Similar to the Space Needle in Seattle, it's basically a high viewing area. Now, even after just 2 days getting familiar with the city, I did find that from this height it was possible to pick out areas quite distinctively. There were views over towards Bondi Beach, towards Manly Beach, and down into the city, looking at the harbour, looking at the harbour bridge, and looking at other areas in the city as well, including botanic gardens and so on. The Sydney Tower is conveniently located in the downtown area, or as Australians tend to call it, the Central Business District. It's a bit of a tongue twister, so we'd stick with downtown. So it is very easy to access, and it's quite close to the main thoroughfare which runs through the downtown area. Now that's actually York Street, which you're seeing here at the moment, and it's also the route that the light rail runs through, so very convenient for hopping on and off at various stops. Now the building here is QVB, and that is the Queen Victoria building. Now it's a pretty spectacular building both internally and externally. It's a shopping centre, and it has been a shopping centre since I believe the 1980s. The building was actually constructed in 1898, and it's had a history which has seen it in use as a marketplace and later in use as accommodation for Sydney City Council before being renovated as a shopping centre. Now, top tip to bear in mind, in the event that you're in the market for an afternoon tea, there are tea rooms in the QVB. I do think they're reservable in advance, so you might need to check that out. In addition to that, however, there are also a range of coffee shops. A number of them tend to market themselves as being Viennese style coffee shops, so I'm not quite sure what the connection is between Sydney and Vienna, but in any case, the common denominator seems to be wonderful cakes, so well worth checking out. Another fun activity in Sydney is a visit to Taronga Zoo. Now, the zoo is actually located in a suburb outside of Sydney, and the easiest way to get there is to actually take the public ferry system from Circular Quay. The journey takes about 20 minutes, and it really is a beautiful way to travel there. I'm absolutely fascinated by the actual ferry system that serves Sydney, and the fact that this is just a standard means of transport for people to get to and from the downtown area every day. I mean, really, with a view like this, it couldn't help but cheer you up on your way to work every morning. So, practicalities about the ferry system. It is part of the integrated transport network, so you can use just debit or credit card to tap on and off as you go, or alternatively you can purchase the Opal card, which you basically load up and you can use on all of the public transport. You load that up with cash in advance. So getting to Taronga Zoo, you arrive at the ferry dock, and there are then shuttle buses to take you to the main admission area. There's also a cable car which you can use, and I'll mention that later on in the video. Now, from what I've read, the word Taronga is an Aboriginal word which actually means beautiful view, and it's certainly the case when you see this kind of scenery. I mean, honestly, there can't be many giraffes that have a home location where they get to view sights like that. Now, I was quite fortunate in terms of the day I decided to actually visit the zoo, because basically the day after I heard news reports about lions having escaped from the lion enclosure, and the whole zoo having to go into lockdown and people having to go to secure areas while the lions were captured. Now, I'm sure it's not a regular occurrence. It certainly was making all of the news as being a very, very rare event, but nonetheless, it's one that I was very glad that I missed out on. The adult admission price to the zoo was $50 Australian, and that was the price for the purchase at the ticket counter. Now, I think if you book in advance online, there is actually a little bit of a reduction on that. Now, here you can see the cable car, which I mentioned is the other way to access the zoo from the ferry dock. So I actually chose to take the cable car back down. It gives good views over part of the zoo, and for me, a cable car is always a fun mode of transport. During my stay in Sydney, as a break from the city, I decided to take a day trip to the Blue Mountains. Now, I did this using a tour company. It was a small group tour, and I organised that through Get Your Guide. The tour company was called Diamond Tours. They're a locally based firm, and there was a group of about 12. It was a very early start. The pickup point was from a hotel in Circular Quay at 6:45 in the morning. Now, the Blue Mountains and the Blue Mountains National Park is located about an hour and a half's drive east of Sydney. Now, a lot of it is on motorway until you start to get into the actual Blue Mountain region. The main settlement there is Katoomba, and the footage here that you're seeing is a view from Echo Point, which is one of the lookout points to see that wonderful, wonderful scenery. Distinctive landmarks, the Three Sisters rock formations, all of those heavily forested areas. According to our tour guide, the Blue Mountains actually takes its name from the blue haze that's given off by the abundance of eucalyptus trees throughout the national park. And I was quite fortunate on the day that we visited that it was very clear and that blue haze was very, very evident. I do know of people who have visited at other times when conditions weren't as good and were incredibly disappointed at not being able to see the scenery at its best. So weather forecast is something to check in advance if you're planning a day trip there. From Echo Point, we travelled a short distance to Scenic World, which honestly, before going there, I was slightly confused as to whether or not this was some kind of theme park or what its actual main purpose was. So all became clear once we arrived. So basically what's involved are 3 different means of transport to take visitors into an area, I suppose, that would be otherwise quite difficult to access. So the first is a cable car gondola ride. It's a very large gondola ride with a partial glass bottomed floor. It goes between 2 particular mountain peaks, so significant views down into the valley below.
Good morning, welcome aboard the Scenic Skyway. My name is Isabel and I'm your driver. I'm going to take you across to Scenic World. Feel free to move around the cabin, check out the views. The glass floor will go clear as we go over the valley. Looking over to your right hand side, you have Katoomba Falls, sitting at 187 metres high. This is the largest tiered waterfall in the Blue Mountains National Park.
That then takes visitors to the main reception area and to the retail outlet. And from there is the experience of going down on what is a 2-minute ride in what is marketed as being the steepest railway in the world. This was not something I was aware of beforehand. And although it has a glass-topped roof on it, which apparently is to allow visitors to experience the scenic views, the steepness of this caused me to close my eyes for the entire 2 minutes. I was by no means the only one in that predicament. It came as a shock to quite a few people on the tour. So anyways, we made it safely to the bottom, thankfully. That took us to basically the floor of the valley, and it was essentially a rainforest. Now there's a boardwalk that takes you through that, so it's an easy means of experiencing what it's like to be in a rainforest. And after that, the final component was then another cable car to take visitors back up to the top level. After leaving Scenic World, we then had the opportunity to visit another few lookout points and experience the wonderful scenery. And from there we travelled on to one of the small towns in the area. This one was called Lura, and basically we had an hour or so there, free time to actually go have lunch, wander around, experience the town. So all very pleasant. The final stop on the tour was Sydney Zoo. Now, not to be confused with Taronga Zoo in Sydney. Sydney Zoo was actually a little bit outside of Sydney. Having already been to Taronga Zoo earlier in the week, I felt that visiting another zoo was potentially a bit of a waste, and that I might have preferred to spend the time instead more experiencing the landscape and the scenery if we had stayed longer in the Blue Mountains. But in actual fact, this turned out to be a really enjoyable experience, and I think that was probably majorly dictated by the fact that here in Sydney Zoo it was possible to get up close to koala bears and kangaroos. So think of Australia and yeah, you're bound to think of both of those animals. So as you'll have seen there in the footage, basically kangaroos were roaming freely in an area where visitors could just simply walk through the areas in which they were back and forth. It didn't seem to cause them any stress. Similarly, being close to the koala bear in this instance, again, it seemed that they were quite used to visitors. Staff members on duty in the area to ensure that guests didn't get too close to the koala bear, but they also had a facility where for $10 they would actually use your own phone and take a photo of you with the koala bear in proximity. So that was quite a nice souvenir. Now, once back in Sydney, I had just 2 days left on the trip, so it was a case of trying to cram in everything else that I wanted to do in the city. Of course, the prime thing would have been a trip to the Opera House and a tour of that. Now, there are lessons to be learned here because I made a mistake. Unfortunately, I hadn't actually booked any tour in advance. I assumed I could just go there whenever I felt like it on the day and avail of a tour. They run every hour and they're 1 hour in duration, and they basically go through the history and architecture of the Opera House and take visitors through various different spaces. Now, unfortunately, the tours were all booked out for the remainder of the 2 days that I was there. So while I just got into some of the inner part, really, I didn't get beyond that. So that is probably one of the disappointments of my trip. Now, another trip that I took was to the seaside suburb of Manly Beach. Now, I got there again using the excellent ferry system, a very enjoyable way to get there. And I hope I'm not offending Australians when I give my views on this, but I actually found Manly Beach to be so much more enjoyable and a much more pleasant area than Bondi Beach. Now, in fairness, I should acknowledge that I visited Manly Beach during the week, so I'm sure the atmosphere was entirely different to what it might be at a weekend when it would inevitably be a whole lot busier. I had experienced Bondi at the weekend, so the busyness was to be expected. While Manly Beach is a suburb of Sydney, it had the sense that it was actually a community in itself. So it felt like it was almost a small, fully functioning town, completely separate from the city. There was a main retail thoroughfare, there was everyday shops there was plenty of dining opportunities, as well as having obviously this beautiful beach at one end and also a smaller beach and the ferry dock at the other end. So overall, a very, very pleasant experience and a very nice place to spend the afternoon. Now, before leaving Sydney, I wanted the opportunity to experience the city skyline at night and to experience all of those wonderful landmarks all lit up. Now, there are a number of ways I could have done this, including taking a dinner cruise. There were several of those on offer, but realistically, as a solo traveller, going on a dinner cruise probably wouldn't have presented the most comfortable experience. So instead, I chose to simply use the public ferry system, and it was a whole lot more inexpensive, that's for sure. Now, just for a couple of dollars, it was possible to take the ferry, which went past the cruise ship, which was in port, past Sydney Opera House, under the Harbour Bridge, and on down to Darling Harbour, and then return by the same route. It seemed quite a popular choice with many tourists, so I certainly wasn't alone in my decision to do that, and it presented a really lovely way to see Sydney at night on my final night. And so, after 4 weeks crossing the Pacific and spending some time in Sydney at the end, it's now time to bring this vlog series to a conclusion. If you've watched along all of the episodes, or if you've dipped in and out, or if you've just found the channel at this stage, the fact that you've watched it is really, really appreciated. If you did enjoy it, or if you found it helpful or practical, please consider hitting the like button. And if you'd like to see more cruise content, and I will do another video on just practical considerations, please consider subscribing to the channel. For now, thank you so much and good night.